Good evening and welcome to Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. I'm Gene Preuss with the League of Women Voters of Houston. Tonight we're going to be talking to two guests about two very important issues. One, the Asian American and Pacific Islanders community here in Houston and some of the things that they've accomplished and some of the concerns that they have, and especially in recent years. And we'll be talking with Kathy Chang about that. She's on my left-hand side here. Thank you for being with us tonight. And then we'll also be talking with Dr. David Branham from the University of Houston Downtown, Professor of Political Science. We're going to be looking at 7 issues on the ballot coming up next month. And if you're voting early, you're going to see them very soon. 7 proposed constitutional amendments to the Texas State Constitution, and we'll be going through each one of those in a little bit. So again, thank you for joining me. We are live in studio. We've got a little different setup today, so bear with us, and no phone calls, unfortunately, even though we are live in studio again tonight. So thank you for joining me. Kathy, thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about the Asian American community, Pacific Island community in Harris County, the Houston area.
Well, in the Harris County area, we're looking at approximately 7% of the AAPI population. And I'm sure, as the general population knows, that in 2020, it's been known that AAPIs has been the rising voters for this election, not just in Harris County, but overall in the United States. So it's a very big group that has increased, but at the same time, it's also underrepresented with respect to Harris County or across the state of Texas.
So in Houston, on City Council, we have an Asian American community, Pacific Island community here in Houston. You say it's about 7% of Harris County. However, as far as I know, Gordon Kwan is the only Asian representative to sit on City Council. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
And there are a few other elected officials, right?
Right. There are a couple of AAPI judges on the district court level in Harris County, like Judge Sandhill, Judge Christina Wims, as well as Rabia Collier. But when you look at the overall number of judges across Harris County, that's a very small percentage of AAPIs compared to the other groups.
So let's talk about the Asian, kind of the background of the Asian community here in Houston, Harris County area. I mean, we can also look at the greater United States, right? There's a lot of people who think, well, it's more of a recent immigration issue, but actually there have been Asian Americans throughout history in the United States, dating all the way back to the early 1800s, right?
That's correct. When you look at the history, the Chinese immigration has always been in existence way back, like you said, in 1800, and that's where the railroad came in. But because of the influx of immigrants, at some point it led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of the anti-Asian immigrants, which a lot of people were not aware until the recent uprising hate against Asian Americans that was brought up. Say, hey, this hate actually existed from a long time ago. It's just that we don't talk about it.
We talk about discrimination and stereotyping in general in the United States quite a bit. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the only, and first and only, law specifically aimed at a certain ethnic group.
That is correct. That is correct. And unfortunately, like I said, it's one of those acts that not a lot of people know about, and it's not talked about. And this is only brought up fairly recently by a lot of AAPI groups, as well as those who are historically inclined to read about it, and like Professor Branham and yourself who know about these things. But to the general population overall, it's non-existent to them because they're just not aware of it.
I think that, you know, the other issue that people are aware of, generally speaking, and because sometimes you see this at the Holocaust Museum and other events that bring this up, is the Japanese internment during World War II. Executive Order 9902, I believe, where President Franklin Roosevelt said, basically ordered 120,000 Americans, and including that are some Japanese-born residents, to be interred mostly along the West Coast in concentration camps. But those essentially concentration camps, right? But some of those camps were in South Texas even. There was one down along Crystal City. So, and one of the Texas Monthly writers has written about this. So there is some knowledge of that. My dad served in World War II. I grew up learning about World War II and studying about it. And we see it in classrooms. But I think that is something, and you have people like George Takei and others who are prominent, who grew up in these camps, that have talked about them. But I think you're right. I think that the general public has very little understanding of that.
Right, and just to give you an example, for me, at my age, I read about it, I studied about it, about Pearl Harbor and the concentration camps, and never thought in my lifetime that I would actually experience it. So I actually myself had experience where some folks came up to me and said, I don't like you because the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And I had to explain, one, I'm not Japanese. Two, I had to go through a long list of things, and then at that point to explain to the individuals that came up to me to say, look, what happened happened. We need to learn from history. We need to do away with the hate that's been intrinsically ingrained in our mind from generation to generation. Because if we don't, this hate continues and discrimination continues on, not just in our group, but that occurs in other community groups as well.
You're with an organization called API.
Right, APAPA.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that organization stands for and what it does?
Okay, let me explain the acronym. First, it's called Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs. It's a nonprofit organization that believes in inspiring, engaging, and empowering the citizens through civic engagement and leadership. So it's a nonprofit organization that proudly established not just in the Houston area, but throughout the state of Texas, and then we have a national chapter out in California.
Okay, so so it does civic engagement. So this is basically a community service type organization?
That is correct.
Okay. And you have an event coming up at the end of the month. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So October 23rd from 2 to 3:30, we'll have a Unity Against Hate rally out in Sugar Land City Hall. That's encompassing not just the AAPI community, but other nonprofit organizations like League of Women Voters, as well as NALEO, LULAC chapters, and Alliance, and also Fort Bend League, Voters League out there. Because it's something that I feel not only do we need to bring awareness about Asian hate, but other communities have also experienced the hate with respect to their communities. So we as a community need to come together as a group, not just as one, because divided we get conquered, but united we stand. So that is the motto that we're trying to ingrain in our community members across the counties and across the state, that we need to start coming together. Regardless of our backgrounds, we all have the same mindset, which is for the betterment of our constituents as well as our children and grandchildren.
Very good. So what how does one get in touch with this organization? How does one become involved? Is it open for everyone to join?
Yes. So unlike some of the AAPI organizations where you have to be a descendant of AAPI, APAPA actually welcomes with open arms people of various backgrounds, ethnic groups, religious groups, anything. As long as you feel the need that you want to serve, you have the passion to serve and be civically engaged. And that's what we're looking for. And in fact, we're looking for young individuals who are interested in being civically engaged, because we do have internships from the high school level to college level and beyond.
What are some of the major challenges, besides, of course, the hate crimes that the Asian American community faces? And I mean concerns, not only as in problems, and we can talk certainly about that, but I also, just what are some of the challenges? What are some of the aspirations and goals that the Asian American community, especially in the Harris County area, seeks to kind of help the community with and to educate people about?
Well, one of the things that we as AAPI communities face is that we're underrepresented, right? No different than other communities where you want to see elected officials that look like you, that understand where you've come from. Because until we have elected officials on the local level up to the statewide and national level to say, hey, I understand what it's like. Your interests cannot be represented. So we're out there civically engaged to educate constituents on the importance of voting, importance of being civically engaged by understanding what's on the ballot. What are the terms, for example, the constitutional amendments that will be on the ballot, right, that's been proposed, and any other thing that's involved, whether locally or statewide, that any constituent would have a voice to say yes or no on with respect to that. And one of the things that we also hone in on is that if you immigrated into this country, there's a reason why you immigrated, right? To better yourself and the family and so forth. And one way to do that is to have a voice. The only way to have a voice is if you vote, because without voting, you don't matter, you don't exist. The very foundation of this country, the beauty of this country, and what makes this country so strong is the democracy. And that democracy comes from your voice, my voice, and your voice. So we're here to make sure that every constituent knows their right and to make sure they are heard.
So besides the voting and the representation, what can we do, or what can your community do to promote better representation? I mean, part of the problem is, are there people running for office? Would be the first question. And if they are, why, and not getting elected, why not? So what are some of the issues that you address regarding those two questions, for example?
Well, like certain underrepresented communities, we have to first get through the layers, like peeling an onion. Mm-hmm. The first layer is do away with some of the mindset that we've been taught, which is don't speak up, don't be confrontational, don't ask questions, just go with the flow. That we have to get rid of. Then is learning that you need to vote. Once you know that that's the right to be involved, then at that point, understand how to be involved, what it takes. And that includes getting involved in nonprofit organizations like League of Women Voters or APAPA or various ones to understand what's on the ballot and how to interact and cross-culturally with the different communities, how to work with each other in getting civically engaged with the various communities, so that we can work together instead of just saying it's just one. Because the reality is we're all minorities in our own groups for these underrepresented ones. If we don't work together, we're still going to continue to be underrepresented.
What about the education? In the United States, we see in the education community the so-called model minority, right? And Asian Americans have for a long time. I think that Fort Bend County, which is a higher Asian community body than Harris County, they also have a higher educational level than Harris County, than a little higher income. And so I think this has lent some people to reinforce that model minority stereotype. Let's talk a little bit about that, and because that works against a community as well, right? Because people have this idea of what the Asian American community is about.
So the stereotype is that AAPIs don't vote. That's a misconception. No different than stereotyping a specific group and saying, oh, this is this group, so therefore this group votes this way or votes the other way. AAPIs have a tendency to where if you want to have their vote, you have to engage them through grassroots campaigning. You have to show up and be there to say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is what we are trying to achieve. You could help by being part of it. Without that, individuals from the AAPI community will not just come out and vote, for, let's say, candidates or specific propositions. That's why it takes a little bit more for the AAPI nonprofit organizations like APAPA to do the legwork, to do that additional work that other communities wouldn't require.
So let's say that I am an elected official or I'm a member of a nonprofit, and we want to reach out to members of the Asian American community become more inclusive? If I'm an elected representative and maybe this is a group that I too have ignored, how do we get more buy-in, more participation?
Well, working with what I would say the community leaders who usually are within that community have the ins. It's kind of like the gatekeeper to bring the elected officials in to introduce them to the communities. At that point, you would have that connection. It would be no different than if you were to go into someone's house, you don't know them, but if you had someone bring them in and say, hey, this is Jean or this is Dr. Brennan, that is the connection right there. But unfortunately, for a lot of elected officials or candidates, that takes too much time. Say one-on-one would take a lot of time, and so therefore there's that disconnect between the constituents and the elected officials or the candidates running for the position. So it takes a little bit more time, but in the long run, once they understand what you're trying to do, what your platform is, and it resonates with them, they become loyal constituents who will vote religiously.
Yeah, they're marketeers. Candidates are, right? Mm-hmm. They go where they think they can get the votes.
Right.
So it's going to be important for them to understand that when they go to your community, they're going to get votes, and they're going to be able to serve your community. A lot of elected officials look and say, okay, I don't think that's where I can get votes. So that's where your organization is going to be so effective, is getting the community activism of the Asian Americans involved in politics, making it a priority. The Asian community has long been so efficient and so dedicated to doing well, working hard, being successful in business and so forth, that the next step will be very effective for the community, I think. And I think you're doing a lot to make that next step become a reality.
Thank you. Well, we're trying our best. And just to give you another example is that different organizations, AAPI organizations, have reached out to elected officials, and they've been very kind about explaining certain things with respect to what is it that they do or how does the position impact them. When you educate your constituents, regardless of whether they're AAPIs or not, constituents would then become engaged. Because if they don't know how important your position is and how it impacts them, they're not going to care, right? But once they understand, that's when they go, wait a minute, hey, commissioner's positions, that's an extremely powerful position, and it impacts me, right? No different than, I may not go to court every day, but I know so-and-so would go to the courtroom as a result of a family dispute or a business dispute, so that impacts my family to some degree. So constituents need to be educated. We know that education is the key thing, whether it's voting or outside the voting arena. When people are educated, they become empowered to do things about that, and that starts with folks like me, League of Women Voters, and other nonprofits to go out there and engage them.
Yeah, it's important that you get all the resources that you have coming to you. Infrastructure, right? Roads, resources, and ability to build businesses and communities. And without politics, unfortunately, it's very difficult to do that. And so I can understand the hurdle. The hurdle is, okay, first I have to do well, but then I have to realize what else affects me and make sure that that's taken care of. And I think it's definitely a great road going forward for you.
Now, I know it's been a challenge for me at times, but I've actually had to give examples to constituents. With the Asian hate crime and also bullying in schools and so forth, I get calls all the time. What can I do? My child's being bullied at school, and of course I tell them go up the chain of command, teacher, principal, trustees, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And when that's been explained, they say, well, we tried all that, we're not getting a response. So then I go back and turn and say, do you vote? Right? And they said, well, what does that have to do with anything? I said, do you know whether you vote or not? That could be seen in your record. So as AAPI communities, if you don't vote, that means your voice is non-existent. Why would they care what happens to your child? Why would they care what happens to your road in front of your house, right? If this is the AAPI community, the road is flooding when the ditch is not drained correctly, properly, but other streets down the road, it's not an AAPI community, they're getting their roads paved correctly. There's a reason, because your elected officials feel like your voice is non-existent. At that point, people started to realize wow, I need to get involved and be civically engaged by voting.
Let's come back and talk about one of the other issues that you're addressing with the rally on the 22nd. That's a Saturday.
Yes.
About hate crimes. I mean, you're talking about bullying in school, and we saw yesterday up in Dallas. There was an incident that seems to have started, from what we know at this point, from a bullying fight incident at school. Where have we seen the recent actions against the Asian community?
Well, I think with the Asian community for school bullying, we have seen where children tend to say, oh, wait, he or she's Asian, skin color's that way, so COVID. We had the prior elected official who called it the Kung Fu COVID or the Chinese COVID. So anyone that looks like me, any children or any adults, even for me, I've had those looks, and sometimes racial slurs to say, hey, go back to where you came from. You got Chinese COVID. You brought it here. So those are the things that our young constituents, as well as the older constituents and elderly, are going through. And it's unfortunate, even though we've tried to change the tide of that thought process, it's been planted. The seed has been planted. Once the seed has been planted, it takes time to undo the harm that has been done. And so with respect to the school system, that's what we see with the bullying. With respect to the general population, anytime I go to the grocery store or outside, sometimes I'll get those looks, right? Even though they know that it's potentially the COVID came from China, I'm not Chinese. But because I am Asian, I have the skin tone, I get singled out for that. Mm-hmm. So those are the things that I go through, as well as all the AAPI community members, that risk that we take when we step outside of our home.
So it's, and news events and especially the pandemic has exacerbated the issue. But it's not isolated to that, and it had been going on before too, right?
Correct. Like I said, this Asian hate has existed since the 1800s, but throughout that history, we have undergone these type of discrimination. It's just that as AAPIs, we are taught not to be confrontational, not to talk about it, because you don't want more hate to arise as a result of speaking out. So we've been taught and ingrained in our mind, just let it go. So that's why the recent shooting and the outspoken event about how the AAPI hate has been in existence was a huge shock, not just to Harris County, but to the entire country and all over the world, because we never talked about it. So in a way, it's good that it's finally coming out, but we also need to do more to make it more aware that we can do better than what we're doing right now. With the Unity Rally, it is to say, yes, let's recognize this, but at the same time, I want the entire community to come together and say, we as different communities experience different type of hate, different type of discrimination, but in reality, they're all hate, and we should not tolerate anything like that. So we come together as a community to rise above that and to remember those who have been impacted by the hate crimes.
Well, once again, let's recap on this is going to be at the Sugar Land City Hall.
Correct.
And it is going to be a unity rally.
Yes.
Against hate.
Correct.
And this is going to be on Saturday, October 23rd. 23rd from 2
to 3:30.
3:30 p.m.
Yes.
What are we going to see when we go out there?
Well, you're going to see a very diverse group of people instead of just AAPI, because like I said, we want to make sure all the community members participate. This country was made on the fact that we have such a diverse population, and the state of Texas is no different, where I believe we're number 3 in the diversity of the highest ranking in AAPIs, and of the various groups with the diversity. I think it is only appropriate that we have this unity rally with the various community members coming together.
Well, Kathy Chang, I want to thank you very much for being our guest and for coming out tonight. I know you're feeling a little under the weather, so thank you for champing it out and driving all the way down here. And we look forward to the Unity Rally. And you know, I'm going to say it here. You are a League member, and so we're very happy to have our League members represented on the show. And for all the good that they're doing, because you are very involved, and we thank you. And once again, we'll give information on how to get and how to find on the web maybe your organization.
Yes, it's apapa.org, and in order to, if you want to get in touch with me, call me directly, 832-788-8840 for any information on sponsorships or to attend the rally for any volunteer work. Again, that's 832-788-8840.
Well, very good. Kathy Chang, thank you so much for being our guest tonight, and thank you for joining us on Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back in just a second. Okay, and as you saw on the screen there, the way to find out more information about the League of Women Voters of Houston, lwvhouston.org is our website. You can also find us on Facebook, LWV Houston, and you know, we're on all sorts of social media. Look for us on hashtags and whatnot. So tonight, we're going to talk about some information that all citizens need to know. But I think, David, this is one of the things that people see on the ballots, and the ballots are coming up. People see this on the ballot, and it's just like something to get through, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of people never know the amendments are on the ballot till they get into the voting booth, and then they start reading, and that's when they make their decision. And I'll be honest, I've been one of those people on occasion who, you know, have just said, okay, I'm going to read this and see if this is what I want. And what I would say is a lot of people start saying, okay, yes. Should I be saying yes? And I think in most cases it's okay to say yes. I think things in Texas are arranged where a yes vote is okay in almost all constitutional amendments.
Well, we say that, but I've got to tell you, when I looked at these, and I'm going to tell everybody where I'm going to, if you want to see what we're looking at and what we're posting on the screen, 411, vote 411, that is .org, and that is take you to the League of Women Voters, and you type in your address, and it's going to show you what's on the ballot. LWVTexas.org is the Texas League of Women Voters page, and they have specific information. They've got a set of videos about each of the amendments where they have young people reading the amendments, the proposed amendments, I should say, to you, and giving the pros and cons. And we've got that information right in front of us here. So we're going to be referring to this. And David, I want to talk about some of these because when I look at them,
yeah,
some of them are pretty vague.
They're very vague.
And so, you know, I say, well, I think I'm in favor of it. And then I when you read, go a little bit deeper, it makes me think. So let's look at these. And we've got slides that we're going to show up on the screen that's going to go through each one of these. That will go through each one of these. So Proposition 1 is about Raffles, the constitutional amendment authorizing the professional sports team charitable foundations of organizations sanctioned by the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, the Women's Professional Rodeo Association, to conduct charitable raffles at rodeo venues. Why do we need a constitutional amendment to allow that?
Because the Constitution says that you have to have a constitutional amendment to allow that. Most people look at it and go, well, that's crazy. What in the world is going on? And we have church raffles all the time.
Right, raffles at school, raffles at churches, and
Yeah,
that's fine, right?
and well, I don't know. There may be times when, and it's a Class A misdemeanor if you run a raffle and you do not do it properly. Remember, we come from a culture where gambling is taboo. And so a lot of people consider this to be gambling. And even though it's for a charitable cause, we're making money for a charity, a lot of people think raffles are gambling, and therefore the Constitution doesn't allow you just to do that. You have to put the amendment in there and say that this is okay in order for it to happen. So, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't usually endorse a vote, but I endorse this vote. I think it's a good idea. Let's let the sports teams have their charitable raffles and say yes to this.
Okay, well, let's go to the next one. So you can say yes. I'm with the league, so I'm going to remain independent on this. County government. This one here is the constitutional amendment authorizing a county to finance the development or redevelopment of transportation or infrastructure in unproductive, underdeveloped, or blighted areas. Now, that seems very straightforward, too. Is it?
It is, and if you live in a city, you know that cities can do this. Cities already can do this, but counties have unincorporated areas where they're not inside city limits. Harris County has a lot of that, especially in Precinct 3 and Precinct 4. So what this amendment's going to do is allow the county government to actually invest in the infrastructure in those areas where there will be no investment unless they do that.
Of course, that might make some people think, well, their debt's going to go through the roof in these areas, right?
Well, it is something of a gamble because you're going to invest government money in infrastructure with the assumption that other businesses will come in, and other businesses, residents, and so forth will come in and use that infrastructure to their advantage. It's a great way to grow the economy. There's long history of government infrastructure being put in communities, and that infrastructure allows for the business growth to occur, the residential growth to occur. So, but there are times when that investment by your government may not bring back the revenue that you think. So there are some people who are hesitant on this.
Okay. Number 3, religious services. Now, this has been controversial, especially during the pandemic. This is what led to this, I think, the constitutional amendment to prohibit this state or a political subdivision of this state from prohibiting or limiting religious services of religious organizations. And I think this was written in response to being the crackdown on meetings and churches.
A lot of people believe it's a constitutional right that cannot be stepped on, cannot be, where you have to have the right to assembly, you have to have the right to religious assembly. That's Constitution. That's, I think, the basis of this. Remember that in the state of Texas, to get an amendment on that ballot, you need 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House. So you need bipartisan support for it to occur. So you have that here, the bipartisan support. But there are a lot of people who are worried that we should be able to have some regulation on this in times when we have a pandemic.
Well, right. So does public health trump other things, right? Does, for the sake of public health, a lot of churches have gone online, right? They're doing Zoom meetings. And I've seen this. I grew up working in radio in high school, and a lot of what we did was do church services. So even back then, even many years ago, church services were on the radio. Now they're on the internet. So do you really have to endanger each other's lives? And that's the question at hand, right? Can they be regulated?
People think that it's not the government who should be deciding whether or not we endanger people's lives. If people want to come together, they think they should have a freedom to come together, and it is in the Constitution. But there are situations when it's very dangerous, and a lot of people think, okay, this shouldn't be the case when really bad situations will make this dangerous. So I certainly don't give a recommendation on this, but I will say this is the issue. I think it's very clear, and people should decide.
It's a big issue.
Yes.
Number 4, judges. Now there's 2 on judges, so let's get through this first one. The constitutional amendment changing the eligibility requirement for a judge of the Supreme Court, a judge of the Criminal Court of Appeals, a justice of the Court of Appeals, and a district judge. But for what? That's not in the amendment, right? It's just saying giving the state the right to change it. So what are the eligibility requirements that this is going to change?
Well, the most basic one is they're going to say, okay, instead of practicing law for 4 years in the state, you need to practice law for 8 years in the state.
So here's some explanations of what's going on, right? That the Supreme Court and Criminal Court of Appeals candidates must be licensed for 10 years now.
Licensed in Texas.
In Texas.
In Texas.
Okay,
you
so
need to be a resident of Texas now, too.
And they have a residency requirement, and then there's also some similar changes for the other 2 judges. So this is what they're talking about, even though it's not in the amendment.
Exactly. And I will say the people who brought this amendment forward were Senator Zaffarini and Senator Huffman, the most liberal and most conservative.
So this is really has
Senate.
bipartisan.
Definitely
buy-in.
bipartisan.
Okay.
This was about qualifications of judges who are running for office, and they felt like they should have a commitment to Texas and a long history of law practice in Texas. The issue for most people, though, is one, shouldn't the voters be deciding what really is qualification? And 2, this will lower the diversity of the field and lower the eligibility of those who can get in the field for these elections. That will be an issue for some people, and why some people will vote no.
Well, you know, that's an interesting topic, and we're going through these pretty quick, but I wanted to slow down on this one because, again, I find the wording vague, and I was like, well, what am I being asked to decide? And once I look at it, I see, you know, it's not a big change, right? It's going from 8 years to 10 years, right?
No, it's going from 4 years of practice
4 years
to 8 years.
8 years. And so it is making a little bit of a change.
Yes.
But a significant change, right? They have to be more experienced now is really what the bottom line is.
They're raising the experience level. I mean, in order to run, you have to have a longer history of experience in Texas.
Yeah.
And that, I think, when you see the people, you see a bipartisan support, it's people who are worried about people running for judge when they're not qualified to run. Or the thinking is that they're not qualified to run.
But, you know, if somebody has 4 years, they do have some wherewithal, right?
I would say so personally, but I'm not an expert.
They want more experience.
They want more, yes.
Okay.
They don't. These usually come out of personal experiences, where Senator Huffman and Senator Zaffarini must have said, "Look, this needs to stop. We have too many people with no experience doing this." So I think that's probably where it came from.
Okay. Proposition 5, the fifth one, is also on judges. So sorry for the confusion. And this one, again, vague. The constitutional amendment providing additional powers to the State Commission on Judicial Conduct with respect to candidates for judicial office.
Okay, we have to go to the basis of this.
Okay.
This is a situation where judicial candidates, if you are a member of the judiciary, you are bound by the Judicial Code of Conduct, which you can get online. You can print it. It's 13 pages. It's a long list of things that if you're a judge, you have to do this. The problem is if you're an incumbent judge running for election, you have to do these things while your opponent does not. And what this amendment will do will allow this organization to have a code of conduct for candidates as well as incumbents, so that everybody has to obey the same rules.
So it's basically talking about leveling the playing field. So while
leveling the rules, where the rules are the same for everyone.
Yeah. So a candidate may not have to follow, as it currently sits, may not have to follow the same code of conduct that a sitting judge has to follow.
They don't, as it currently sits.
Okay.
Okay, I don't think this is a big issue, but apparently it came up in some election along the line where a candidate who was not an incumbent, not a sitting judge, was able to do things that were against the code of conduct that an incumbent judge could not do.
Right.
And there, so they felt that it was unfair for incumbent judges running for office. Incumbent judges have a strong advantage when they run against opponents. This will make that advantage even stronger. But I wouldn't say that it's a bad amendment. I'm just saying that what they're trying to do is level the rules and the playing field when they do this.
Which some people would see as good. Other people might think a bit of an overreach, maybe.
Well, if you think it's an overreach, get the code of conduct out and see if you think that everybody should abide by that. I don't think most candidates violate the judicial code of conduct. It's very rare. But if they do, I think it's probably a fair thing to say they should abide by the same rules as their opponent.
Okay. All right, so let's look at Proposition 6. This is another thing, another issue that has come out of the COVID pandemic. It's really changed our world, hasn't it? In a lot of different ways that we may not even think of.
It has. If there's any good that comes out of it, it allows you to see situations that need to be adjusted, and that when we need to provide some relief to people when they're in very bad situations. So
what this one says is the constitutional amendment establishing a right for residents of certain facilities to designate an essential caregiver for in-person visitation. Now, I actually personally experienced something like this. My mother-in-law, who, bless her heart, got trapped with us. Right, she was down visiting when COVID broke out, so she was kind of stuck with us, and she's been with us ever since.
I have to resist.
No comments there.
Other than I feel so sorry for her.
So she had a fall and had to go to the hospital and was at the hospital for a couple of weeks mending up. And during that time, although one of her nephews was visiting, who is a trained health professional, works in hospitals, he could not visit her because they had to only designate one person, and that was my wife, her daughter, to visit. So he couldn't go in, and so we saw this. I mean, because people didn't want to get exposed. The hospital beds were already overcrowded. So this is an issue that comes out of COVID.
It does, right? Yes, and it's and I have to say I think it's because we see situations like the unfortunate situation you were in.
Yeah.
And we need to make adjustments. And I'm surprised there's not more amendments on the ballot adjusting for situations that we faced in COVID. So this is one of those situations, and because I will recommend that we should vote for Proposition 6.
Okay, so some people might be against it because they think, well, this is going to affect people, government officials or hospital officials' right to limit people coming in and out of the hospital, possibly exposing them. I mean, look, hospitals are the number one place to get sick, right? Because people with disease, who have diseases are there, and that makes everybody more susceptible to it, right? But also bringing in diseases, right? So
yeah, almost all of us have encountered that situation. We had loved ones in the hospital, and so I do understand the issue there. But at the same time, I also understand that caregivers are so important to the health of people who need to heal.
Right, and it's not just the caregivers, but it's the personal reaction, right?
Sure.
It's like you don't want to be in the hospital alone.
Well, I mean, I couldn't imagine. My mother passed away a couple of decades ago, but I was fortunate enough to be her caregiver while she was ill, and I just can't imagine having to leave her alone. That would have been a nightmare beyond belief.
Surrounded by people she didn't know.
Absolutely, it's just.
And my mother-in-law says the worst part about it was, because everybody was wearing masks, all she saw was this part.
Yeah, that's really.
So, I mean, that's very impersonal.
it's unfortunate, and it's an unfortunate part of COVID-19 that affected a lot of people negatively.
Well, let's talk about property taxes, and that's Proposition 7, a property tax exemption, the constitutional amendment to allow the surviving spouse of a person who is disabled to receive a limitation on the school district's ad valorem taxes on the spouse's residence of homestead if the spouse is 55 years of age or older at the time of the person's death. I'm totally confused. I wrote this, but I mean, now it's like my head is spinning. So explain this to me.
It just extends the exemption to an extra circumstance, from what I understand. Because I'm in the same boat. I mean, disabled individuals may apply for that $10,000 homestead exemption to limit the school district property taxes.
Right.
Right? And so what this does is extends that just an extra to an extra.
So that if I have a spouse who is disabled,
yes,
and we have a property exemption because of their disability, after they die for a limited amount of time, that exemption will
goes
continue.
over. Yes,
I see.
That can goes over, and you have to be 55 or older.
Right.
At the time of the person's death. So if you're a young person, it doesn't count. But if you're older, you can extend that exemption. So what it does is it extends the exemption for age.
Right.
And it's probably something that most people will support, because what you're doing is extending the exemption for somebody who's lost a loved one and had the exemption before.
Well, I can also see, though, that some people would be against this. One, because it's like, well, you know, there's always the argument that, well, if they're not paying taxes, that means I'm going to have to pay more taxes, right? Or that the school district is not going to get
all true.
In as much income.
All true.
I also wonder if there might be people who this doesn't affect, people under 55, people not married to someone with a disability currently, who think, well, this doesn't apply to me, why should I support it? Or why should I care about it even, right?
Yeah, I mean, that if you vote purely on self-interest, yeah, people who aren't in this situation will vote no, because it does give you some tax relief because these people will pay taxes. But the thinking here is that these are people that deal with a disability. They got a tax exemption because of that disability. And if you have a disability, you're not, I mean, you have a lot of things going.
It can certainly limit your income to begin with, right?
Absolutely. It limits your income, it limits your ability to work, it limits your ability to function, and you have to have somebody taking care of you. So all those circumstances, a lot of people say that's good enough to say, oh, look, let's give them a tax exemption and allow them to have some relief. And then if that person dies, to allow them to continue that relief, because now they're by themselves. And you know, if you lose your spouse in a home, especially if you have payments, a lot of times you've lost that second income.
Right. And if you lose a spouse who you've been a caregiver to, you know, depending upon their level of disability, I mean, it's not like, well, you know, I'm going to have the funeral today, then I'm going to go out and find a job the next week, right? This is to allow for some grieving.
I'll be honest, I've went through the situation, and yeah, I stopped working in the process of taking care of my mother. So you're right, I had to get a job. I was very fortunate to get a job very quickly, but it was out of fortune and out of, you know, people who cared about me putting my name forward and saying, look, this is a person who's ready to go back on the workforce. A lot of people don't have that advantage. I did, and I appreciate it, but in this situation, you know, you make your decision, but that is the basis of the amendment.
The final amendment, Proposition 8, I say amendment, but it's a proposition. You know, just to be clear, the constitutional amendment authorizing the legislature to provide for an exemption from ad valorem taxation to all or part of the market value of the residence homestead of the surviving spouse of a member of the armed services of the United States who is killed or fatally injured in the line of duty. Now, there's a lot to unpack in that. This is probably one of the most straightforward written
It is.
Amendments, but there are some things. So again, Ad valorem. So that's Latin for the value, and that's our property value, right? So an exemption from property taxes on, this is the interesting thing, all or part of the market value. Well, who's going to make that determination? Is that the tax assessor collector?
Well, yes, and
Okay.
the situation is that's already part of another amendment. It's there.
Okay.
What this amendment mainly changes is, before, if you remember armed services, you had to be killed in action.
Okay.
Now this extends the same exemption to people who are killed or fatally injured in the line of duty.
Right.
So it doesn't need to
So you don't have to be killed in action?
in
So
action, yes.
I was talking to a neighbor of mine who was in the military, and he was talking about somebody, there was a truck caravan that was parked, and somebody put the truck in gear, turned off the engine, and when they started it up, somebody was in the middle. The truck lurched forward and trapped somebody between it, and that person perished. So not in the line of duty, I mean, in the line of duty, but certainly not in action.
Exactly.
Right? And so the question is, should that person's family have some relief? This amendment would say yes, right? If
This
passed.
amendment would say yes. It doesn't have to be on the battlefield. If you lose your life as a military officer or serviceman in the line of duty, in the line of doing
your
your
job.
service to this country, that you will get this tax exemption, just as if you lost your life in the battlefield. So that's the major difference with Proposition 8. That's what's making the difference. The rest of it, it's sort of unfortunate, but a lot of that's already there.
Okay.
It just makes that one simple adjustment that will extend that exemption.
Well, those are what is going to be on everybody's ballot, the first thing we're going to vote on. If we look at the other issues, depending on where you live in the county, I mean, you can see this all over the state, right?
Sure.
Wherever you are in Texas, you're going to see this. But if you're in Harris County, if you're in Houston, there might be a couple of school board elections, HISD, I think, ALEAF, Spring Branch, and a couple of others have a couple of positions up. HCC has some trustees that are running. Lone Star, maybe. And then there's some, of course, other offices.
It depends, because
Depending,
Lone Star is staggered district, so yeah.
Yeah.
So you may or may not see that.
So these are some of the things that you're going to be seeing, but these for sure you're going to be seeing these various problems. And it's important, I think, for us to know what they're about. And as you say, is there any harm in voting just yes to everything if you're not so sure? But at least now we've read through them all. We've kind of provided, hopefully, a little bit of background. Thank you you provided some background I wasn't aware of, and maybe some clarity on some of these more vaguely written statements.
Yeah, that's if a proposition doesn't pass, it's usually because it's poorly written and it's very vague, because you're getting 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate support before it even gets on the ballot. So
Now, that's
sometimes,
an interesting point.
yeah, sometimes it's poorly worded. Sometimes there's legitimate reasons for opposing it, because you may not like the bipartisan legislature that put it through, or it may be something personal for you that you don't like. But do understand that if, in most cases when these amendments are up, they have broad bipartisan support, and you can kind of rest assured that they're based on something that most Texans want.
Okay, David, we only have just a few minutes left, but as a political science professor, why are Texas constitutional amendments so, in some cases, so minuscule? Like this Rodeo Association or Cowboy Association, why do those two organizations have to ask permission to do something? Why can't the legislature just approve some of this stuff? Why do we have 1,000, I'm exaggerating, amendments to the Texas Constitution?
Well, 500. We have more than 500,
Right.
right? The Texas Constitution is 85,000 words long. So I think it's about 3/4 of it is now amendments. The reason why, though, is because the Constitution says you have to do it this way. Legislatures are not all powerful in the state of Texas. They can't just pass a bill saying it's okay for them to have a raffle, for these sports teams to have a raffle. We bounded it into the Constitution. The Texas Constitution was made with a lack of trust in government overall. So if we think back to the way it used to be, 2-year elections for governors, and just not a lot of trust for our elected officials. So that's the reason why it's bounded up. The League of Women Voters says it on their guide very well. Why does the Texas Constitution have so many amendments? Rules for how state and local governments should run are very specific in the Texas Constitution, unlike the U.S. Constitution. And there are state constitutional scholars like Chris Hammonds at HBU who tell us that this is actually a necessary thing for states, because the U.S. Constitution actually gives a whole lot of power to the states. The 10th Amendment basically says anything not in this Constitution goes to the states or the people. That means the states have a lot of power, and that's the reason why we have such a long Constitution.
Well, David Branham, thank you very much for helping me get through these 8 proposed amendments, because to be totally honest, I didn't understand them all, and so thanks for providing that clarity. If you'd like more information, you can contact the League of Women Voters of Houston, lwvhouston.org. Also, you can go on to the Texas League of Women Voters page, that's lwvtexas.org, and get more information. And you can also look up sample ballots for wherever you live and see what's going to be on your ballot at vote411.org. That's also a League of Women Voters. Lots of other information on how to vote, who's eligible to vote, and there are some important voting dates that we have coming up. Early voting is about to begin. So that's on the 18th, the first day of early voting, and that goes on for several days. If you want to apply by mail, to vote by mail, you have to do that by October 22nd. So there's a list of days. If you'd like more information, contact the League of Women Voters, and we'll help you out. David Branham, Associate Professor, Professor of Political Science at University of Houston Downtown. Thank you for joining us. A special thanks to Kathy Chang for coming out and talking about APAPA and the upcoming Unity Rally in Sugar Land. For the League of Women Voters of Houston, I'm Gene Preuss. Thank you for joining us on Public Affairs Public Access on Houston Media Source TV. Have a good night.